Top 13 lessons from disasters in identity management. I just delivered this session at the European Identity Conference put on by Coppinger-Cole, and I was very honored to be introduced by Martin Coppinger himself, the founder of Coppinger-Cole. Automation is very powerful, and we need to learn from Mickey's lesson in the Sorcerer's Apprentice. Things may have started off swimmingly. They may end that way too. During the session, I invited people to share some of their stories, and that was quite fun. At an identity management training class, one delegate told us how the university where he worked went live with the new identity system, and suddenly all the Active Directory groups managed by the new system had 0 members. Their consultants also had 0 experience with that platform before implementation. Experience matters. To a degree, proper testing can help mitigate a lack of experience, but only to a degree. I got called in to look at a situation at a Fortune 100 company, where one day all the managed groups had been depopulated. Turns out that an export process failed, outputting a single row. The process did check its inputs, but a single row satisfied that check. However, checking for some acceptable ratio of changes would be even better. There on the right, you can see, for example, checking the new count, the old count, and then dividing and seeing what the ratio is. I gained a new client when they contacted me to help them fix their identity management system. In a blink of an eye, while they were transitioning from one HR system to another, an export failed, and the input to the identity management system had only 439 rows instead of 7,778. Suddenly, AD deleted 7,339 accounts. The recycle bin had not been enabled, and they didn't have good backups in Active Directory. So, to solve the identity management problem, we added some quality assurance checks. We used SQL queries to ensure that we didn't import too little data or too many changes. Then we checked the ratio of deletes to the total, checked the number of deletes to export against the number of acceptable ratio, and also limited the number of deletes that could be processed in one shot. Eventually, we changed the approach altogether so as to not act on an absence of information. This is a great rule that's been propagated by my friend Carol Wapshire, better known as Miss Ms. One of my clients insisted on creating Active Directory accounts through a process outside of the identity management platform, and then to join to the HR records based on the first and last names. Brilliant, I know. What could go wrong? No amount of persuasion convinced them otherwise, or even to include the employee ID in the user object. Because HR wasn't inputting the data into the database on day one, instead they waited 5, 7, 10 days until payday, and that's when they input the employees into the database. We couldn't get them to change that because we didn't have executive buy-in. That is until the janitor with the same name as the VP of HR was terminated, and the system automatically cut off access for the VP. Lesson: executive buy-in helps you get processes changed. I heard of another project to automate user account provisioning and deprovisioning from HR that got canceled because of an issue with preferred display names. When you have VPs named Spencer Jones, who wants to be known as Snappy Jones, and another one named Ivan Maxwell Smart, who wants to be known as I Am Smart, and you don't have a mechanism for dealing with that, that can be difficult. So user habits can die hard. They want what they want. And if you don't have executive buy-in, you don't have a way to handle those user habits, you're going to encounter some trouble. One client had cell phones throughout Active Directory, making it very easy to contact one another, but after one or more employees in their stores had issues with stocking, and I'm not talking about shells, we're talking harassment, legal required that the cell phones were removed from the directory, and it required employees' consent before publishing it. So we worked with HR to provide a field for users to update their own cell phones and to remove it. The same client also later needed a mechanism for preferred last name to protect a woman who was fleeing a violent situation. In the middle of a project, the pre-existing identity management system turned off access for the identity management project manager because when they had created his user, They had gone in and looked up his employee ID so that they could then run their scripts. Well, they had grabbed the wrong employee ID. Consequently, his account had been linked to another employee's record, someone with the same first initial and same last name, who also happened to be a janitor. At a casino, human resources changed the job codes in the HR database without warning. The next day, many groups depopulated. The lesson here is to watch out for HR and check your inputs, especially the volume of changes. I recently visited a potential customer where they told me of how in the employee newsletter there was a photo of an employee's workstation that had a sticky note with the password on it. That's right, the photo wound up being inside of a newsletter that got distributed to all the employees, revealing this one employee's password. Whew. But I've got a story that could top even that. I got pulled aside by border security in an unnamed country, and when I explained what I was there to do and how I was there to actually train their government's security agency, their version of the National Security Agency, on identity management and single sign-on, the official grabbed his ID badge, flipped it over, and showed me his 10 usernames and passwords that he used to access their national security databases. Fortunately for him, I do not have an eidetic or photographic memory. In another situation, we had a group whose criteria was job equals doctor and location equals 52. It had 36 users in it. However, 12 of those users shouldn't have been there, as they weren't part of the New York unit. Instead, the group should have had 24 users. Well, when the administrator updated the group criteria, they put an or instead of an and that caused the group to have 4,000 users, most of whom weren't supposed to be in that group. Then someone emailed the group with confidential medical data. Oops. Lesson here, test your results. Test it as you build it, test it as you deploy it, test it as you make configuration changes. The next disaster was in the lab. So I was trying to install SharePoint as a prerequisite for Microsoft Identity Manager. Various services would fail to start after reboot. I discovered that the service account no longer had logon as a service right. So I granted the user logon as a service. All right, things worked. I rebooted, fell again. So I granted the logon as a service. Repeat, it failed. Repeat, it failed. Finally, I said, what's going on? The client didn't know. Eventually did some thinking and came up with group policy as a possible culprit. So I ran GP result and I discovered there was an insane group policy object that would go in and strip out rights from all accounts unless they were in specific groups, taking away logon as a service, logon as a batch job, etc. Our next story comes from Ross Curry from Australia, who tells us of a client that designed a self-service password reset architecture with the following 3-step workstream. While remote, you forget your password. Then you log into the reverse proxy with your username and password, which you can't remember. Finally, reset your password using questions and answers. Kara Wapshire tells this terrifying tale of being told to replace an existing identity management system without clear requirements, what she calls a like for like. I was asked to review a failed solution that was well over schedule and budget. The customer thought they'd done a great job providing detailed requirements, but they were too specific based on how the existing solution did things. The previous supplier had done their best, but without enough of an understanding of the way the new platform does things, they had written reams of custom code to do things that the new platform already does perfectly well, just not in the exact way the existing solution did it. The project was a complete disaster, and the customer did eventually hire us, and we started over from scratch, starting with rewriting the requirements to describe the what instead of the how. Lesson, get clear requirements about what needs to be done. While making massive changes to the identity system on Christmas Eve, due to changes in the HR system, someone took a shortcut and kicked off a process with a workflow that was mislabeled as a notification workflow. Well, it did do a notification right after it reset the password of 800 users. It notified their managers about it. So beware of hidden traps. One client told a consultant to make changes that would result in the user counts of 400 pharmacists and techs being renamed right at the start of their day. But no one told those users what their new username was going to be. Sometimes you have to ask the client the right questions to ensure the right thing is being done and to protect the client from themselves. In summary, experience matters. Check your inputs. Get executive buy-in so you can get processes changed if need be. Remember that user habits die hard. Protect people's privacy. Follow the guidelines from compliance. Assume there's going to be bad data out there. Watch out for HR. User education. Test. Test as you build, test as you deploy, test as you configure. Beware of group policy objects that do strange things. Get clear requirements. Beware of hidden traps and protect the client from themselves. Now, in a little bonus feature, one of the attendees sent his story in to me, and I'll share that with you now. From Patrick von der Hagen, we get a story about SharePoint. A new system was being developed based on SharePoint, storing the user principal name as an identifier for its users. Since the user principal name contained the last name, there had been warnings from identity management that might be a bad idea. But the developers didn't listen. They didn't consider it to be a serious problem for people to get married or get divorced, and therefore wanting and receiving new user principal names. Accordingly, losing access to their data. After introducing the software, that's exactly what happened. Their thought was, that's okay, it's not too bad, it's still pretty rare. Later, however, that can be handled by tickets and our support staff. But even later, they realized, we can't fix this without changing our keys. Turns out that the user principal name was not only used as an identifier in the SharePoint application, but as the primary key. And therefore, all of their other tables relied on that. And so they had the foreign key. The UPN was in those other tables as a foreign key. So this resulted in significant changes that needed to happen to their software. But it still took ages until people accepted that they needed to refactor. Now, is this really an identity issue? No, this is more of a development issue. But it involves identity, and identity management still got blamed for this. Thank you for listening. Appreciate your time. And I hope that you've learned some good lessons from this on how to avoid disasters in identity management.